Summer before last, Polly Harder and I were booked to lead some students of Proust around Paris in one of the several tours. And the very wise lady who was putting together the tour featured, so that it wouldn't look like it was for fuddy-duddies, featured Holly on the advertising in the brochure. Not just Holly Harder, but Holly Harder running a marathon. And the economic downturn intervened. It didn't happen, and I was very disappointed not to have the chance to follow Holly around Paris. But this is an especially nice moment because of, in the first place, all that Holly has done for us. Professor Harder is an outstanding Proust scholar. She's associate professor at Brandeis. She is the key figure in the Proust Society's Boston action. And already mentioned, and it makes this all so nice, she was a student of the man we honor, Roger Shattuck.
Thank you very much. Just because the New York Marathon just happened last week, I feel like I should say that it's perfect training for reading this novel, obviously. And I should also add that hearing that the talks that have already happened before this one, in a very Proustian way, I think, you'll see that a lot of, well, some of the same ideas will be repeated, but obviously in different ways, because as soon as you think you have an understanding of a character in Proust, you realize a couple pages or a couple volumes later that what you thought may not be the entire truth, or there might be a complementary truth that goes along with it to complete that. And I think that this will be a Proustian moment for us all in that sense, perhaps. I was asked to speak about Françoise and the La Duchesse de Guermantes. And when considering the place of La Duchesse de Guermantes and Françoise in Proust's novel, it seems natural to focus first on the obvious differences that separate the two characters. Compared to Oriane, with her classic grace and elegance, Françoise, the cook and housekeeper in Combray, and then in Paris, appears woefully unsophisticated. She prefers the traditional hearty fare of bourgeois cooking to the refined dishes served on aristocratic tables. She equates the level of one's respect for the dead with the choice of one's mourning attire. And to the great chagrin of the young protagonist, Françoise does not, alas, wear a blue plume in her hat when she accompanies him to the Champs-Élysées. But despite their obvious contrasts in class and manner, the cook and the Duchess do share a number of qualities related to their respective social positions, their attention to style and detail, especially in their clothing, and their distinctive sense of how to perceive and interpret the world. Both Françoise and Madame de Guermantes, within their own social circles, command a certain amount of influence that earns them profound respect, but also generates a degree of disdain. For example, throughout much of Proust's novel, members of the upper class are beholden to the Duchess for invitations to her selective soirees because they are eager for, but also often resentful of, the stamp of social success that her acknowledgement and approbation represent. Françoise, as well, exercises a level of authority over those in her entourage, whether it be the pregnant and suffering kitchen maid in Combray or her fellow domestique at the Grand Hotel in Balbec. In the realm of clothing, the Duchess's unforgettable ensembles, her yellow dress with huge black flowers, which I've never understood how that was tasteful, but that's another point. The dress with black flowers, the infamous red gown and matching shoes, and her Fortuny garments serve to define her tastes, but also underscore more dubious moral priorities. Françoise, for her part, manages to stand out among the crowd at the Combray train station in a hand-me-down coat and hat from the narrator's great-aunt that was recuperated from her rubbish bin. But thanks to the talent of this cook and housekeeper, these worn-out articles of clothing have become for the narrator objects of delicate artistry that recall the portraits of Anne of Brittany and paintings by Chardin. And if Oriane charms and mystifies friends by seeing the world through the lens of her Guermantes wit, which may or not be funny, Françoise, in a similar way, invokes her ancient and uncompromising code to grant meaning to unimportant and even irrelevant situations, leaving the narrator often perplexed and astonished. Of course, Françoise and Madame de Guermantes, Of course, Françoise and Madame de Guermantes, their disparate social status notwithstanding, also claim an indelible connection to la France profonde, the French heartland, the cradle of French identity, the fabled source of national spirit and Gallic principles. As members of the aristocracy and the peasantry, the Duchess and the cook share political, historical, and geographical associations that date back to the feudal period. In the absence of a central government at this time, the poor in French medieval society sought protection from the propertied class. And for both peasants and nobles, the land provided a means for survival, but also as a source of cultural unity and identity. Seen in this perspective, the profound connections between Françoise and Oriane become a bit more apparent. Although the two characters come from different social and economic classes, they share, for example, a distinctive way of pronouncing words that date back to medieval times. In Proust's novel, the linguistic traces of this ancient past create a kind of verbal terroir of old France, a set of special sounds and meanings that resuscitate the sights, sounds, tastes, and ambiance of long ago. The narrator tells the reader that the Duchesse chooses words that seem the most Ile-de-France, rarely straying beyond the pure vocabulary that might have been used by an old French writer. Similarly, he says, Françoise's words, very much like the quote that we just heard, Françoise's words are inspired by traditional and local sentiment, governed by extremely ancient laws that seem to decorate the Parisian home of the narrator like a glass case in a local museum, filled with specimens of the curious handiwork which peasants still carve or embroider in certain parts of the country. But despite these linguistic parallels, important distinctions emerge that prove for the narrator that Françoise's language is actually the more seminal and the more fundamentally creative of the two. If the Duchess's accent and choice of words perpetuate the 16th century language of Henri IV, it is Françoise's way of speaking, with all of its grammatical mistakes and malapropisms, that represents for the narrator the genius of the French language, its true creative spirit. The faulty pronunciations and hilarious verbal missteps of the cook and housekeeper reflect the very evolution of French. Now, of course, a very highly esteemed language, but which to some extent, the narrator reminds us, is but a garbled version of Latin and Saxon. You should remind your French friends of that next time they correct your pronunciation. The innate spirit of creativity that characterizes the speech of Françoise, but that is missing from Oriane's way of speaking, helps to explain some of the historical, social, and artistic undercurrents of Proust's novel. On a certain level, Madame de Guermantes, as a member of the nobility, represents a world whose very existence depends on continuity and permanence, the exact opposite of change. The well-known expression, long live the king is dead, long live the king, expresses this idea that the monarchy cannot fail to continue. Individuals do come and go, but their personal identity is always subsumed by their rank. What counts is not a particular person, but rather the fact that there is always a Marquise de Montmorency, a Countess of Provence, and a Prince of Luxembourg, ready to perform the prescribed duties of the upper class. Because the lower echelons of society cannot aspire to the same kind of permanent standing bestowed by titles, the continuity that they maintain is of a different nature, stemming from the never-ending process of their work. Individuals come and go here too, but their identity is confirmed by their activities. There's always grain to sow, fields to harvest, homes to build, and meals to prepare. To illustrate this idea, we can take as an example Françoise's cooking, which allows and in fact embraces innovation and creative modifications. Against a permanent backdrop of traditional offerings such as bread, roasts, stews, and sweets, Françoise transforms ordinary ingredients into dishes that rise to the level of culinary artistry. Her meals, like her language, and like most of Proust's characters, evolve as a result of significant transformations that they undergo during the course of the novel. Just as the beef in Françoise's signature dish, the bœuf à la mode, becomes like a sponge to soak up rich juices, Characters in Search of Lost Time undergo profound changes over time, and as a result, reveal previously unsuspected traits, both qualities and defects. This fundamental difference between Madame de Guermantes and Françoise, the repetition and sameness of the aristocracy, in contrast to the creative changes embodied in the lower and eventually in the middle classes, helps to explain the decline of the Guermantes and the French aristocracy, the rise of Madame Verdurin and the bourgeois class, and the elevation of Françoise's cooking as an eventual model for the narrator's future novel. Still another example of the significant differences that define these two characters, and this was something that we've talked about before, another example of the significant differences that define the two characters along the lines of creativity versus sterility are the ornithological associations that Madame de Guermantes and Françoise share. When Oriane appears at the opera, her swan's down fan and the simple aigrette that she wears in her hair enchant the narrator. For him, these accessories recall the crest on the head of a bird and reinforce his fantasy of the Guermantes as descendants of the magical coupling of a mortal and a divine mythological bird. In contrast to the stunning vision of the Duchess as a beautiful swan, Françoise, in the poultry yard at Combray, strikes a starkly different pose when the time comes to behead the chicken that will serve as Sunday dinner. The filthy beast that refuses to submit to Françoise's knife will eventually, under her skilled hand, be transformed into a succulent roast, a chicken with skin as golden and nearly as venerated as the vestment of a village priest. Françoise's very active transformation of this lowly chicken, compared to the lovely but immovable appearance of the swan-like Duchess, underscores the contrast between the sterile aristocratic world of Madame de Guermantes and the turbulent creativity of the characters that characterizes Françoise and the popular classes. So, on this celebration of the 100th anniversary of the publication of Swann's Way, this idea of change within a certain framework of stability also speaks to the experience of reading and rereading Proust's novel. The volumes themselves do not change, of course. It is we who evolve and are transformed. Proust's novel shows us that even within worlds that we think we know, worlds that we think are consistent and constant, there can be enormous change, especially when art, and particularly literature, shed new light on ordinary things, people and places, and help us see our same old world with brand new eyes. In this sense, too, finally, the work of Roger Shattuck, the critic, scholar, and mentor to whom this conference is dedicated, can represent and inspire, even today, a distinct spark of creativity within the continuity of Proust's literary studies. Building upon his foundational work on Proust, readers and scholars have been able to continue Roger Shattuck's exploration of In Search of Lost Time, reaching out in new directions to advance his genius, his particular creative spirit, in the realm of Proustian criticism. It was under his direction that I began my work with Françoise, and I hope that my own modest contributions bear appropriate testimony to his continuing legacy. Thank you very much.
We have time for a question, a remark, but as I say, you'll have a chance again. And we will, after we have heard from Professor Taylor, we will take a 10 or 15 minute stretch break before we ask Harold to join us for the conversation at the table with all of the speakers. Anything right now, or should we go right on?
Right.
Yes.
Jay told me to be quiet.
Okay.
Press all.
Benjamin Taylor is the source, to my mind, of an excellent and balanced reading of Proust, one that never departs from the clear meaning of the text. I say this as the result of the sneakiest kind of eavesdropping. He hasn't written yet his book on Proust, and I've not sat in on any of the reading group meetings here at the center. But you will find, and I recommend, on the web, a full recording of his Columbia seminar on Proust. So I recommend to you that path around the registrar at Columbia for auditing his course. Then you really shouldn't offer that for free. It's much too good for that. It's not mentioned in your program, but Professor Taylor is also the author of a travel memoir, Naples Declared, A Walk Around the Bay. As an old lover of Naples, I envy him his obvious skill in applying for grants. What a great idea. That this enormously well-published scholar is the leader of a Proust reading group here at the center is emblematic of the high level of this work that is maintained here at the center. Professor Taylor.
Thank you, Stan, and my congratulations to the two winners of this year's Shattuck Award. My thanks to Noreen for so much over the course of now a year and a half. And I'm very honored to be here owing to the lateness of the hour and because I want a seventh inning stretch myself. I'm going to be brief, but I'll just say that it was a lot of fun yesterday and this morning to think about villainy in all its literary varieties. I began with the aristocrats, Iago or Claggart. These are men so abysmal in their evil that even authors as supremely great as Shakespeare and Melville don't attempt to understand their motivation. The jealousy or envy of Iago is a kind of placeholder for motives that Shakespeare finally finds unsearchable, just as the thwarted sexual passions of Claggart for Billy are a kind of placeholder for an evil so vast, so deep, belonging to darkness and old night, and unsearchable. So we come from them to a different sort of villain. Let's say, let's call them hero villains, Macbeth, or Captain Ahab, or Heathcliff. Villains who are figures of magnificent will and drive, monomaniacal drive, whom we can make some bond of fellow feeling with. And yet they resist us too in their sheer monomania. Coming from them to the third group, in which I'd like to place my subject, Madame Verdurin. I would say that Undine Spragg in The Custom of the Country, or Jean Brodie in The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, or Madame Verdurin, these are not exactly avatars of evil, though bad enough for all normal purposes, let's say. Endless in their mischief, Undine Spragg, a naked climber whose ambition is to become the wife of an ambassador. She succeeds in this about as well as Wallis Simpson succeeded at becoming Queen of England. Miss Jean Brodie, a gifted, massively egocentric educator, overly enmeshed, to put it mildly, with her students, and with a lot of sexual stuff not sorted out, and a liking for fascism, a fatal liking for fascism. And then we come to Madame Verdurin, who has no given name, but we know her despite the absence, as we know many people in this book, despite the absence of either first names or last names, we know quite well. And Madame Verdurin is, not a naked social climber. To the contrary, when we first see her, she is the leader of a little clan, a little nucleus that defines itself by its opposition to the world of the Faubourg Saint-Germain, to fashionable society. They are dedicated to art and stand against all conventionality, all Philistinism. And the chief attribute of Madame Verdurin's nature, I would say, is a kind of ruthless tribalism about her set. She divides the world into allies and adversaries. One knows this kind of personality from life in New York City. You don't have to be in the Belle Epoque of Paris or after. She has another remarkable trait that one also knows from one's own experience. She is a specialist at driving the wedge between people. And we see her, of course, attempt to do this with Swann and Odette. We see her do it cleanly, neatly, in one brutal scene with poor Brichot and the love of his life, a laundress. But that will not do, according to Madame Verdurin, and those two have to be separated. She's not going to have anybody in her little clan who is in love with the laundress. And of course we see it in one of the most chilling scenes in all of literature, when she divides Charlus from his great love, Charlie Morel, a scene of enormous complexity, and it's a scene in which the real malevolent powers of Madame Verdurin are truly on view, because you realize that Charlus is never the same again after that occasion, never the man he was. In fact, there's a kind of sickness unto death that overtakes him after he loses Charlie, who's no prize package, but one doesn't in this book love people according to their objective worth, because that's not the nature of love. What else would I say about Madame Verdurin? She has a kind of power to reveal herself over the course of the novel that detaches us from her more and more. The countervailing monster in the book, a monster of fundamental goodness, a figure on the scale of Don Quixote or a Falstaff, is the great Baron de Charlus, a figure about whom enough can never be said. One can't say enough about Madame Verdurin, but not about Charlus. And my experience of this book it's now 3 readings only, and there are people in the room who've read it more than that. But my current feeling is that the more one gets to know Madame Verdurin, the more one loathes her. The more one gets to know the Palamède, Baron de Charlus, in all his fallenness and flawedness, the more one loves him and sides with him. And they are both still alive and kicking, and both still entirely themselves in the last scene of the book. The last we see of Charlus, he could not be more completely himself. He's chasing a boy. And the last we see of Madame Verdurin, she could not be more herself. She has achieved her ultimate aim after years of covert planning and careful stratagems. She has ascended to the peak of the Faubourg Saint-Germain in the guise of Princesse de Guermantes, having married him after he is widowed. The earlier Princesse de Guermantes we meet has died, and the Baron, the Prince de Guermantes, reliably homosexual, has married Madame Verdurin, making her Princesse de Guermantes. Her pretense at loathing for the aristocracy has withered and been replaced by insider status. This is one of the great developments of the book, but a kind of metamorphosis that is not inconsistent with a sameness of personality or consistency, as Anka said earlier. She is indeed who she always was, but who she always was is not apparent in this novel. Who Undine Spragg is always apparent in the custom of the country to take to make that contrast. I've selected one passage in particular that has always haunted me, and it's not so much quoted, but I think I will just content myself with this point. It takes place during the period of the war. Madame Verdurin, on account of her extraordinary aesthetic nature and her sick headaches, requires croissant, but everything is being rationed because it is wartime, right? And yet Dr. Cottard has been prevailed upon to provide her with prescription croissant. She's reading the morning paper, and the morning paper contains dire information. The Lusitania has been sunk. I'm haunted by this passage because Proust, with the genius of the very greatest novelist, and it's a short list of novelists who can do a thing like this, Tolstoy, Henry James, a handful of others, pulls the rug out from under you in your emotions about Madame Verdurin, which you are very settled into the perspective of seeing as not like you. But here in this passage, the loathsome Madame Verdurin is human, all too human, and your own frailties are also lit up by this passage. An event of the enormity of the sinking of a ship with men, women, and children aboard afflicts her far less than the simplest domestic discomfort. And one has to admit to knowing this emotion. A modest discrepancy in the household accounts matters to you more than the agonies of a friend who is somewhere else. All of this leads to the conclusion that we are not as we ought to be. We know Madame Verdurin's not as she ought to be, but in this passage, we too are included. I will conclude with it. The Verdurins thought certainly of these hecatombs of regiments annihilated, and passengers swallowed by the waves. But there is a law of inverse proportion which multiplies to such an extent anything that concerns our own welfare and divides by such a formidable figure anything that does not concern it, that the death of unknown millions is felt by us as the most insignificant of sensations, hardly even as disagreeable as a draft. Madame Verdurin, who suffered even more from her headaches now that she could no longer get croissant to dip in her breakfast coffee, had eventually obtained a prescription from Cottard, permitting her to have them specially made in a certain restaurant of which we have spoken. This had been almost as difficult to wangle with the authorities as the appointment of a general. The first of these special croissants arrived on the morning on which the newspapers reported the sinking of the Lusitania. As she dipped in her coffee and gave a series of little flicks to her newspaper with one hand, so as to make it stay open without her having to remove her other hand from the cup, "How horrible," she said. "This is something more horrible than the most terrible stage tragedy. But the death of all these drowned people must have been reduced 1,000 million times before it impinged upon her, for even as, with her mouth full, she made these distressful observations, the expression which spread over her face brought there, one must suppose, by the savor of that so precious remedy against headaches, the croissant, was in fact one of satisfaction and pleasure. Thank you.